We're going to be talking about the business cycle and output gaps. I'm then going to be introducing you to the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. So before we look at the ADAS model, let's remember that the business cycle shows how an economy slows and grows over time, moving through periods of expansion, peak, contraction, and then recovery. At times, the economy grows faster than normal. At other times, it slows down or goes backwards. These movements above and below the economy's normal level of activity are what economists describe using the idea of an output gap. We looked at these gaps in your earlier lesson, that being a negative output gap and this being a positive output gap. The business cycle graph is useful because it shows what is happening over time, but it doesn't explain why the economy is overheating or underperforming at a particular moment. That is where we use a different model here, which is our aggregate demand and aggregate supply model or graph. The ADAS model helps us to understand how spending in the economy, productive capacity, and inflation interact at a certain specific time. So what's the difference between output gaps and inflationary and deflationary gaps? An output gap compares actual output with potential output. An inflationary gap or deflationary gap describes what happens to price pressure as a result of that output gap. So now let's introduce the ADAS diagram. The horizontal axis shows output, or how much the economy is producing. The vertical axis shows inflation. First, focus on the vertical line in the middle, labeled potential output. This is also known as long-run aggregate supply. Potential output is the level of production the economies can sustain over time without causing problems like inflation or rising unemployment. Think of this as the economy's normal, sustainable speed over the business cycle. Now look at the upward sloping curve labeled short-run aggregate supply. I'll do that again. Sorry about that. Labeled short-run aggregate supply. This shows how much firms are willing to produce in the short run as prices rise. As prices increase, businesses are more willing to increase output by using workers and machines more intensively. Now look at point B, which sits to the left of potential output. At point B, the economy is producing less than its potential. This is called a negative output gap, and that's the difference between those two. This often occurs during the downturn or trough phase of the business cycle. Businesses are not fully using their machines and workers, unemployment is higher than normal, and inflation tends to fall below its target. To improve this situation, the Reserve Bank, which we will learn about later, may try to stimulate demand, for example, by lowering interest rates. On the diagram, this is shown by aggregate demand shifting to the right, moving the economy closer to output. This brings us to point C, which is this curve here, where aggregate demand intersects with the SRAS exactly at potential output. At this point, the economy is considered to be in balance. Output is sustainable, inflation is around target, and employment is close to full employment. This is what policymakers aim for over the course of the business cycle. Now look at point A, which sits to the right of potential output. At this point, the economy is producing more than its sustainable level, which is the difference between those two. This is called a positive output gap. This often occurs during a strong boom or peak in the business cycle. In the short run, firms can meet this higher demand by increasing hours worked and using existing equipment more intensively. This movement along the short-run aggregate supply curve shows firms temporarily increasing output for this part here. However, this cannot last. When the economy is running above capacity Workers become scarce, wages rise, and businesses face higher costs. As a result, inflation rises above the target range. Once again, as we will learn later, to slow the economy and reduce inflation, the RBA or Reserve Bank may raise interest rates. This reduces aggregate demand and helps bring the economy back to point C. The output gap is really about how hard the economy is working. If the economy is exactly what it can sustainably handle, the output gap is 0. If it's producing more than normal capacity, the output gap is positive, which is the difference between those two, and less than capacity, like B, which is the difference between those two. You can think of it like a car engine. Cruising at a steady speed is 0, revving too hard is positive, idling or struggling is negative.